but it's kind of nice because we're able to, go through. And one of the things I can do, which is kind of neat, is I can take a screenshot, and now I'm able to actually write on the screen. So what is biology? Well, biology is the study. Bio means life, right? Bios is life in Latin. Logi, anytime you see logi, it means the study of. So biology is the study of life, okay? Now, one of the things to think about, if we're studying life, well, what is life? What makes something alive and something not alive? That's the question, okay? And so there are certain criteria that we use to define living things. And so we're going to spend a second then talking about the criteria of life. So let me just get a blank screen here. And let's think about some things that all living things share that perhaps things that aren't alive don't share, okay? And so there are certain criteria that are very important to living things that all living things share. One of the most obvious is the criteria that says all living things respond to stimuli. Okay, let's think about what this means to respond to a stimulus. Okay. Let's say I have a stove right here, okay, an electric stove. And let's say on, I turn two burners and I get them just glowing red hot. Okay, on one of the burners, I put a rock. What's the rock gonna do? It's not gonna do anything. It's gonna heat up, right? It's not gonna react. And on the other burner, I put my hand. What am I gonna do, right? I'm going to respond to that stimuli. In this case, the stimulus is pain caused by the heat. And I'm gonna jerk my hand back and I'm gonna scream and yell and curse a little bit. Maybe I apologize for that. So I'm responding to a stimulus. Another really good example is if you have houseplants, especially in the wintertime when they're kind of all hanging in the window, right, soaking up the sun. And what do you do to them? It's kind of cruel. You turn them around, right? And what do? They turn back toward the light. Okay, so all living things respond to stimuli. It doesn't matter if it's a big thing or a little thing, it responds to stimuli, okay? Let's think of some other criteria of life, because that's really just one. All living things have a metabolism. What does that mean? They use energy, right? And so let's think about this. We can think about the different kingdoms of living things like plants and animals and fungi and bacteria and all that. One of the things that you may not realize is that the virus, of which we know so much about now, don't we, is not living. So, the COVID-19 virus, it's not a living thing. Why not? Because it doesn't have a metabolism. Viruses don't have any way of generating energy and using it unless they infect a host. And then it's the host cell's energy, not their energy. Okay. Another one that's important is the ability to reproduce. And a fourth is the ability to grow. If you're a living thing and you can't reproduce and you can't grow, then, well, you're not going to be living for very long, are you? So, these apply to all living things, from a single-celled bacteria to a blue whale. It doesn't matter. They are able to reproduce, And then, there are little baby bacteria and they grow up to be big bacteria. Okay. So these four are considered to be the most important criteria. Now, the other thing we want to point out is the cell is the smallest unit of life, right? And so irregardless of, what you believe ethically or whatever, it's pretty clear that a cell is the unit where life begins. Okay. If we want to, to build on that idea, how do you get to a cell? How do you get to this living thing? Well, what we have to do is we really have to start out talking about some chemistry, because we need to be able to, learn about what cells are made of, in a sense. Okay. So some important discussions. Can you think of anything that's not alive that shares these criteria? One of the, I've asked my students this question many times, and I get some interesting answers. Last year, I asked my students this question, and there was one kid, he was kind of sitting toward the back, and I could tell he was really thinking on it. And then he said, he just got this light bulb went off in his head, and he said, "Dreams, man." So I thought that was pretty funny. Dreams, who am I to argue with that one? Fire, fire reproduces, it can grow, it has a metabolism, it uses energy. So, there are, and it responds to stimuli. So there are non-living things that you might force into these categories, but for the most part, all living things share these criteria. Okay. This brings us to a really important word, and that word is homeostasis. So let's talk about homeostasis for just a second. And homeostasis, if we want to define what that word means, what it means really is maintaining a relatively constant this thing's a little awkward to write on, sorry. Internal environment. Two important words in this definition, relatively and internal. So living things have to maintain some relatively constant internal environment, or they don't remain living for very long. And so what does this mean? Well, think about things that are controlled in you that you don't have to think about. Some examples of homeostatic mechanisms in us: temperature, right? There is a thermometer in your brain. It's a thermostat, really, and it maintains a relatively constant internal environment. The thermostat is set at 98.6 approximately. Now, we know some people run a little warmer and some people run a little colder, and that's okay. But we know that it's relatively constant, right? You could get a viral infection, again, like the COVID, and spike a fever. And so, but what is that there are parameters in which you can survive. And you should know that if your temperature gets much above 104, people are like, "Oh, he fried his brain, man." Well, not exactly, but kind of, your body can only take a certain temperature, right? At which point you're beyond the boundaries of homeostasis and you die. Same with getting too cold, right? You can get hypothermic and the same thing can happen. You can die. So that's the relatively constant thing. There are, it's the thermometer, the thermostat's set at 98.6, and it can go up or it can go down. But if you go too far up or too far down, then the organism can't survive. And the other part about it is internal, right? It could be 105 degrees outside, and you go outside and your body's 98.6 degrees. And so we don't have a way to control the external environment always, although we try, don't we? But Our bodies control the internal environment. Some other homeostatic things, blood pressure, right? pH is another important one. If your blood gets too acidic, you die. Respiration or breathing rate, pulse rate, these are all things that are homeostatically controlled. Okay. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what homeostasis is. And now, what is life made of? In other words, what are the building blocks of life? And this logically sends us into talking about chemistry, right? And so when we start thinking about chemistry, we have to think about elements and matter, okay? And we're going to come back to the question of what are we made out of in terms of matter and elements. But by definition, matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. That's pretty much everything, right? Even air is matter because air has mass, right? Air doesn't seem like it weighs anything until you compress it into a bottle, and then it does, right? And so what humans want to be able to do is classify matter. And the way that we classify matter is by using this idea of elements, right? And so if we want to think about, what elements are we made out of primarily, if you look at living things, 99% of what we're made out of is carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur. These are the elements, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and sulfur, that make up 99% of you. And then, of course, the other 1% are things that are in smaller amounts, like calcium and magnesium, okay? Mostly we're made out of water, so that explains the hydrogen and the oxygen, right? And then we're going to learn that organic compounds have a carbon backbone. And so carbon, living things are carbon-based on Earth. And that's going to be important to understand. The last thing to think about is, what is the smallest unit of an element that exhibits the properties of that element? We call that an atom. And so now our discussion is going to go into talking about atoms. We could talk about an atom of carbon or an atom of hydrogen. And that logically brings us into thinking about and talking about the periodic table of elements. And you can see that here. And so humans have created this periodic table as a way to basically classify all of the different types of matter, all of the different elements. Many of these are man-made elements, right? And then the ones toward the top are naturally occurring elements. And so you can see, for example, here's H, which is hydrogen, and it has the number 1. It has an atomic number of 1, okay? And so we're going to talk a little bit about the language of the periodic table, okay? And so there's a great deal of information here. I'm going to blow this up and I'm going to do H. I'm also going to do O over here. One of the things is the atomic number, right? And there it is. And then down here is the atomic mass, and it's also 1 for hydrogen. Okay. And then here's O, and it's maybe a little hard to see, but O has an atomic number of 8 and an atomic mass of 16. Okay. So there's a lot of information here, in the periodic table. We're going to talk about what these numbers mean in just a second. In order to do that, we really have to talk a little bit about the subatomic particles, which are protons neutrons and electrons. So let's go there now. Let's think a little bit about that. We'll be coming back to the periodic table of elements. You know, one time I jokingly told my class, you know, you might want to just go ahead and memorize this, and was joking and figured everyone knew that. But one student didn't find that funny when she did try to memorize it, and then I gave her a copy of it on the test. So I'll try not to be sarcastic about things that I say, because I realize some people might take them literally. Okay. Let's see here. Let's look at the subatomic particles. And this may actually be the last slide that we look at today in this video. This will get us a good ways down the road. So, what are we dealing with here? Well, all atoms are made up of these three subatomic particles. Protons, it turns out, are positively charged particles. Neutrons are neutral, they have no charge, and electrons are negatively charged particles. So protons, neutrons, and electrons make up all of the all atoms. Okay, so if we go back, now that we know this, if we go back and think about the periodic table, let me just get a blank screen here, and let's do a little lesson now on a little more about the periodic table. Let's look at oxygen again. Remember, oxygen was 8 and 16, okay? And we said 8 was called the atomic number. And it turns out that the atomic number is equal to the number of protons in the atom. And so because the atomic number is 8, you know that there's 8 protons in oxygen. Okay, that's just the rule. What about hydrogen? Well, hydrogen must have 1 proton. Now, down here, remember, was the atomic mass. And the atomic mass is equal to the number of protons plus neutrons. All right. And so what does this tell you then? Well, if this number is 16, that means that it's the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So by you doing some very simple math, you can determine how many neutrons this particular element has, right? If it has an atomic mass of 16 and the atomic number is 8, well, we know that's the number of protons. So 16 minus 8 is equal to 8 neutrons in oxygen. Simple way to calculate that. Okay, what about the electrons? Well, it turns out that the electrons are not included in the mass, and they're not included in the mass because they don't weigh enough. They don't weigh a significant amount. And so we just basically say they don't weigh anything, and so we're not including them in the mass. How do you know how many electrons there are? Unless there is a net charge shown on a particular element, an atom of an element, then you assume if it's neutral, then it must be that it has 8 electrons. The electrons and the protons typically are equal to one another unless a charge is shown. Because remember, protons are positively charged and electrons are negatively charged. And so the charges effectively cancel each other out. Now you may in chemistry see something like this, Na plus plus. This is telling you that this particular element has, the Na is sodium, by the way. Okay, and if I show 2 plus signs here, I'm saying that it has 2 positive charges. Well, that must mean it has 2 more protons than it has electrons because it's showing a positive charge. Okay, so you know, little tricks to the language here that we're learning. And we are pretty much out of time. That's a very good start. I am happy that we made it as far as we did, actually. Here, let's just look at this last slide. You can see the atomic number equals the number of protons. The atomic weight or mass equals the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. And then one last thing that I'll mention, and we'll retouch this next time, is the idea of an isotope. So an isotope is an element with one or more extra neutrons in its nucleus. Okay, and we'll talk about isotopes next time. I do want to tell you one other thing. The videos that you're going to be watching are actually videos that I'll be doing in another Bio 111 class, which is actually a live Zoom class that takes place Mondays and Wednesdays from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. And so what you're going to be watching each week are recordings of the videos that I did for that class. That means you can expect two 50-minute, roughly 50-minute long videos each week to watch. That's 2 hours of time commitment from you each week. Now, the video next week, depending on how far we get, there may be some reviews. So for example, maybe I didn't get quite as far with them on the first day, and so that you'll be watching their second day video. You won't ever miss any information, but the first part of the information might be something that we covered in this video, is my point. And then after that, it won't really matter. I did make you a special video today for the introduction. Okay, so each week you're going to watch two 50-minute videos. That's your time commitment. You can watch them 5 times if you want, but you at least have to watch them once. Once we get through all the videos, then I'll open up the lecture test and you'll have a week to take it. I think this is going to work out just fine, and I'm looking forward to teaching you. If you have any questions, please send me an email. Otherwise, adios, class. I'll see you next time.